What do you think of this idea of going back and catching people's words and throwing them back at them when they were wrong?
I'm in favor of it. I mean, I expect that Newsweek magazine and all the rest of the magazines will figure in Don Carrett's Hall of Shame at some point, and rightly so. You know, the media, like all institutions, don't like self-criticism. It's painful, it's embarrassing. But it does seem to me that we need to go back and examine how we did. Where if we went wrong, why did we go wrong? Was it because of lack of knowledge on our part, or was it because of bias and ingrained attitudes? And I think it's a healthy process. If we are to learn anything out of this of relevance to our domestic situation, it seems to me we do need to examine the assumptions and the knowledge with which we went into the conflict.
Originally from Martin in the United Kingdom, attended Oxford University, worked for the Sunday Times of London, with Newsweek since 1985. What are you going to do on your vacation?
Carry on renovating my house, since we moved into a new house the day before Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait.
Do you intend to complete this project while you're on vacation?
I don't think Newsweek's going to give me that long a vacation.
John Barry, National Security Correspondent for Newsweek Magazine. Thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you.
To our audience, have a nice day.
That concludes this live viewer call-in program focusing on diplomacy in the post-war period. And now this programming note to be with us this evening for remarks by President Bush before a joint session of Congress. Our coverage begins at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 p.m. on the West Coast. Next, it's remarks by the former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Richard Perle.
From the halls of Parliament in London, England, C-SPAN brings you the British House of Commons, and with it, common sense. For an inside look at the proceedings of England's Legislative Congress, Common Sense provides you with an overview of the powers of Parliament and examines the role of the Queen. You'll discover what members do in a typical day, how a bill becomes a law, and the history of television coverage in the chambers. Common Sense also gives you a handy guide to terms, a valuable reference. To order your copy, send a check or money order for $3 to C-SPAN Common Sense, 400 North Capitol Street, Suite 650, Washington, D.C., 20001.
Up next, it's a portion of yesterday's conference of presidents of major American Jewish organizations. The group met to hear from a number of legislators and policymakers about post-war issues. The organization is comprised of 46 national secular and religious Jewish groups, and they convened the conference to demonstrate their appreciation for the international effort against Iraqi aggression and pride in allied troops in the Gulf. Among those they heard from were the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Zalman Shoval, House Speaker Thomas Foley, and Senate Majority Leader George Mitchell. Next, we'll hear from former Assistant Secretary of Defense Richard Perle.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. By now, everyone is sick of briefings, and so I will be brief. And I can't help but say at the outset that I agree with essentially everything that Martin Indyk has just had to say, and will try not to repeat excessively his well-formulated points. This was a war conducted with extraordinary skill, courage, and determination, not only by the men who fought it, the men and women who fought it in the field, but by the command structure in Washington, beginning first and at times one was tempted to think almost exclusively with the President of the United States. There were innumerable occasions when many counseled a course different from that that the President chose to follow. moments when a so-called political solution seemed to be close at hand if only we demonstrated a little bit of flexibility. And for resisting on those occasions, and then for having the courage to act on his convictions, we owe an enormous debt to the President. We owe a debt to three other world leaders, too, who deserve to be mentioned before the chapter closes on this war. First is Prime Minister Thatcher, who will be in Washington later this week. From the very beginning, she was absolutely rock solid, and indeed in those first several days when Western policy was being formulated, I think it was probably Prime Minister Thatcher more than anyone else who saw clearly that there was no alternative but to oppose, even if it meant war, the aggression of August 2nd. Second, my favorite prime minister, now the president of Turkey, President Özal, who almost immediately after the invasion made the decision, without taking the pulse of public opinion, had he done so he might not have made that decision, made the decision to close the pipeline through which Iraq's oil exports flowed. This was promptly followed by a similar decision by the Saudis, and those two acts made possible the effective sanctions, which in turn gave us time to organize to fight the war, because if we'd had to fight immediately, it would have been a very different situation indeed. And he too acted with great courage and without concern for the political ramifications. He's got his hands full at the moment with some domestic discontent, in part over the high costs that Turkey has had to bear. And the third leader, who is neither a president nor a prime minister, but an ambassador, is the Saudi ambassador to the United States, Prince Bandar. He was, throughout this conflict, a remarkable example of clarity that went far beyond what one would have expected from a narrow national point of view. He understood the broad interests of the coalition. He counseled wisely, including this government. He was, for example, among those who thought it foolish to play with the notion of an international conference in the midst of this crisis, and said so. And he was instrumental in persuading his own government of the policy that it ultimately adopted, and without which the coalition could not have been brought together. This war could not have been fought to a successful conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, without the restoration of American national strength that was the preoccupation of the Reagan administration. And so there's a last president who deserves a bit of credit for what happened on this battlefield, and that's the man who brought us the forces to do it. I mentioned the rebuilding of America's defenses in the 1980s, not simply because I was proud to be a part of that effort, but because we will face in future the question of how strong it is wise to be, what risks it is wise to take by allowing national defenses to decline. And let me just say that had we been called upon to fight this war in 1981, we would have been unable to do so. If we were called upon to fight this war again a decade from now, it is far from clear that we will be in a position to do so. And I take pains to make this point here because, as everyone in this room knows, there has always been a division within the Jewish community over the issue of how much of our national resources should go to national defense. And by and large, with the exception of a minority, the view has been that we should err on the side of risk-taking. The Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs was founded in part in a response to concern about whether there was a sufficient appreciation in the Jewish community for the importance and the requirements of national strength. No other country in the world could have conducted this campaign, and unless we maintain the strength that enabled us to do so, no other country will be able to do it again. And I hope we bear that in mind as we consider the size and the nature of the defense budget, not just now in the warm glow of a great victory, but as time goes on. We could not have brought this to a successful conclusion if we had been lured into accepting Soviet notions of what constituted a peace settlement in the closing days of this crisis. And it is among the many judgments of the President that deserve to be noted that he was not tempted by a false peace, by a peace that would have left Saddam Hussein in power, by a peace that would only have deferred the time when we would ultimately have had to confront that military power. And on a number of occasions, the help from Moscow was reminiscent of Moscow's involvement in the closing days of World War II in the Pacific, when, having failed to contribute any forces to the Allied victory, they showed up in time to claim Japanese territory. And clearly they had something similar in mind in the Middle East. Martin has made the point that one of the lessons of this war has something to do with the relationship between territory and security. In an age of missiles, it was said, one doesn't need to worry about territory. The striking thing about the missiles that we observed falling with little effect, thank God, on Israel and on Saudi Arabia, was that that was all the Iraqis were able to do at that distance. Put them in the West Bank, by contrast, allow them to load up 155 millimeter howitzers with shells containing chemical weapons, and there is no end to the damage that could be done. The possession of territory matters, and it matters as much today as it mattered at the time of Alexander the Great. And whatever the outlines of future settlements involving territory in the region, the security of Israel depends on being a safe distance from the weapons that can be most readily delivered, especially against population centers. Let me make two brief points in conclusion. There is some reason to believe that the turbulence of this war and the lessons of this war will create opportunities. It's not inevitable, it's not guaranteed, and there are plenty of people around who would like to see opportunities that are now only vague prospects terminated even before they begin. I think one of the important lessons of this war was learned by the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the UAE and other Arab states, principally the wealthy oil-producing states. And that lesson is that the exploitation of the Palestinian question, in this case by Saddam Hussein, but by the PLO leadership and by other radical organizations, who for years have depended on those states for support. The exploitation of that Palestinian issue can only in the long run lead to the destruction of the Saudis and the Kuwaitis and the UAE and the rest. And if they have now absorbed that lesson, there is some reason to hope that they will pursue different policies in the future, that they too will come to understand that a solution, a realistic and stable solution, one involving the recognition of the legitimacy of the State of Israel, is the only hope even for those states who in the past have put their confidence in the support of radical elements and terrorist elements. Whether that germ of an insight, learned the hard way in some places, is permitted to grow and flourish will depend in part on whether we in this country recognize that there is some time for this is a time for new thinking about the region. And already one hears signs of old thinking, chiefly contained in the notion that Israel has to make all the concessions if there's to be movement toward peace. And finally, let me conclude on one highly parochial note. We all marveled at the way in which large numbers of innocent lives were saved by the ability to intercept missiles that would otherwise have exploded on Israel's cities and the cities of Saudi Arabia as well, for that matter. The United States remains without any missile defense whatsoever as we speak. President Reagan tried, beginning in 1983, to encourage the idea that it was unwise to be wholly undefended, totally vulnerable to missiles that might be fired at us. And yet today, in 1991, we still remain hopelessly vulnerable to missiles that might be fired at us. Saddam Hussein started this war too soon from his point of view. He started it before he had a nuclear weapon, although getting one was high on his agenda. And he started it before he had a missile with sufficient range to reach the United States. We won't always be so lucky. And the time is long past for movement toward the development of a ballistic missile defense to be set aside in support of some silly notion of stability that will mean nothing if the missiles ever start to fall. And I say this mindful of the fact that there's probably not a lot of support in this room for the idea of moving ahead with SDI. But I hope the experience that we've just been through will contain this last lesson, and that all of us will rethink whether it is wise to go wholly undefended into the distant future. Thank you.
Both Mr. Perle and Dr. Indyk have agreed to take questions. I will start with Rabbi Newberg.
Mr. Perle, you were the AA when the Jackson-Vanik Amendment was passed. What is your position on the Jackson Amendment right now?
Excuse me, one moment before you answer the question. The room will be under security within the next few minutes because we are expecting Secretary of Defense Richard Cheney, and therefore there will not be permitted any traffic going in and out of the room. So I urge you to please stay in your seats so that we can declare the room secure. Excuse me, Mr. Perle.
The amendment was written quite deliberately so as to allow the President, under certain appropriate circumstances, to set aside the restrictions of Jackson-Vanik, but only for a year at a time, subject to congressional approval and renewable annually. As we've seen the turbulence in the Soviet Union, particularly in recent months, it is well to remember that giving up the linkage that was created by that amendment between emigration and trade benefits for the Soviet Union permanently would be profoundly mistaken, in my view, because we have no way of knowing whether the Soviet policy of opening the doors will continue in effect. We have no way of knowing who the leadership will be or whether the current leadership will change its policies. So a waiver, when the Soviets have implemented laws that move substantially toward free immigration, that allows the trade benefits to flow for 1 year at a time, seems to me the bargain that was put forward in 1972. It made sense then, and it makes sense now.
Yes, your question, please.
David Saperstein, Union of American Hebrew Congregations and Central Conference of American Rabbis. I want to add my own expression of appreciation to the two speakers, not just for the excellent presentations. I don't think that in the past few months anyone has done more through their calm, analytical presentations on the Middle East situation to help the American people understand the realities of that situation and the threats, the genuine threats that Israel faces than the two of you have done on television, and we're all deeply in your debt. I'd like to ask you each to spend a minute or two about that new thinking. It was with superb presentations about what has taken place. Let's look to the future. We know what we want done for the United States to develop policy that, using its new credibility and influence, will enhance the chances that within their own interests, the Arab countries will be encouraged to sit down with Israel, to take the kind of steps we've talked about. Could you spend a couple of minutes talking about what that new thinking would look like, those new policies would look like, the policy directions that you think might actually accomplish those goals?
Thank you for the kind remarks. Let me dwell on one point in particular, because it's a point of some immediate importance. And it's impossible to address this issue without appearing to take sides on a dispute that divides opinion in Israel as well as elsewhere, but that can't be avoided. It seems to me the least likely way to encourage new thinking of any sort is now to organize an international conference at which old positions will be rehearsed. And yet that is virtually inevitable if we now pull together both those countries in the region who, as a result of this experience, may be prepared to think anew, and countries who clearly have no interest in thinking anew and no desire to do so, and probably no capacity to do so. We will get at an international conference the lowest common denominator. And the notion that we have to submit to that because the Syrians are unwilling to be seen in public negotiating with Israelis, or others need cover, is a way of acknowledging the heavy weight of the old thinking, if I can put it that way. The time to break with that past, if it can be done, is now. And an international conference would only encourage that we continue along the old lines. Now, what is the key change? It seems to me the key change must now be a recognition, by the Gulf states at least, that they too have an interest in bringing to a conclusion a dispute, the exploitation of which is used to intimidate and ultimately to destroy them. That's how Saddam Hussein used it. That's how it will be used by others. And they therefore have a stake in a stable peace in the region, and that must entail a willingness to negotiate face-to-face with Israel and a willingness to conclude agreements with Israel that recognize its legitimacy. The rest is detail.
Richard has set an example in being very concise on this, and I fear that I could preoccupy a good deal of time talking about it, so let me try also to be precise, following on from what he says, which I heartily endorse. The first point is, in my opinion, that the region is now in a state of shock, particularly the Arab world. And there is, as David Saperstein has suggested, a window of opportunity here for the United States, provided that we move expeditiously and wisely. And therefore, I would say that I am quite forward-leaning about the need to move on the peace process. It's a question of how it's done. And beyond what Richard has said about avoiding an international conference, which I heartily endorse, I would also argue that we need to avoid that other hardy perennial that comes up at the end of every war, which is another plan, American plan. We had a bad experience with the Reagan plan in that regard, and we should clearly avoid a Bush plan for the same reasons. It only gives the parties in the region something, as the Secretary of State suggested the other day, to shoot their scuds at. Rather, we should be getting behind Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia and supporting the kinds of ideas that they are now prepared to come up with, and giving them a bit of a nudge in that direction. Secondly, I think we do need to engage the Arab states. The logic here is very clear. For 2 years, the process has been focused on Israel and the Palestinians, and it went nowhere for that reason, because the Arab states were not engaged. There is an opportunity now for the Arab states to make Israel an offer of genuine peace, which then makes it easier for Israel to make the Palestinians an offer of genuine reconciliation. And that is the process, the Arab states to Israel to the Palestinians. There can be no resolution of the conflict, no real peace on the Arab side unless there is some movement on the Palestinian issue. But by the same token, Israel cannot move on the Palestinian issue unless there is a real, genuine commitment to accept Israel in the region as a Jewish state, as a Zionist state. and to live with it. How the United States promotes that is something, as I say, we could get into great detail. I take it you want me to finish a few words. But I do feel that the opportunity exists there in the combination of Arab states that are now on our side in the war and have the potential to remain on our side through the post-war period. First of all, Egypt, the largest Arab state already at peace with Israel. Secondly, Saudi Arabia, the richest Arab state, not at peace with Israel, but also not a frontline confrontation state. Saudi Arabia can help the process, can support those frontline states and the Palestinians who would make peace with Israel. In the past, they have been subject to the threats from the local mafia, and they have preferred to pay protection than any other alternative. Now we have demonstrated our ability to protect them. They have demonstrated their willingness to depend on us. They are now in a position to lend support to an American-led process. And I believe that they are prepared to do so from my own discussions with them. They no longer insist on an international conference, nor do they insist on Yasser Arafat at the table. They talk in realistic terms about Israel, and they talk about their willingness to end the Arab boycott, to drop their anti-Israel actions in the United Nations, and even to accept full normalization of relations with Israel once the Palestinian problem is solved. Now, of course, that has always been their position in one sense. Once the Palestinian problem is solved, everything becomes possible. But they talk much more realistically about their vision of a settlement with Israel, and in terms that I think meet Israel's concerns much more than before. And secondly, as I said earlier, they seem to me to be prepared to support an American-led process that would encourage others, particularly the other Arab states and the Palestinians, to come to the table with Israel. The key third partner in this Arab state coalition is the Syrians. And there we have a very big question mark. And I fear that in Washington we will make the same mistake with Hafez al-Assad as we made with Saddam Hussein. But it will be much more difficult to do so this time around, precisely because of the lessons learned from the attempt to accommodate Saddam Hussein. And it's entirely